I brushed my hand down my ex's arm during the wedding dance, and my husband's expression dropped like a stone into dark water. The moment replays in my mind now, 3 months later, as I sit in our kitchen staring at divorce papers that appeared in my mailbox like an end sentence I never saw coming. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Dorian and I had finally tied the knot after 2 years of engagement, and Felix, my personal trainer and, admittedly, my ex-boyfriend from college, had somehow ended up at our reception. My mother Vivienne had insisted on inviting him, claiming it would show everyone how mature and evolved our family was. "Lunelle, darling, you can't live in fear of your past," she'd said while addressing wedding invitations. "Besides, Felix has been such a positive influence on your fitness journey. Dorian should appreciate that." The memory makes my stomach clench now. Felix had looked incredible that night. His dark hair perfectly styled, his suit tailored to show off the physique I'd helped him maintain through our training sessions. When he asked me to dance, it felt natural to say yes. After all, we were just friends now. Adult friends who happened to share a history. But when the music started and his hand found the small of my back, something shifted. Muscle memory, I told myself. Just the familiar comfort of someone who knew how I moved, who anticipated my steps. My fingers traced down his bicep, not intentionally, just naturally, the way they used to when we were together, the way they never quite did with Dorian. I didn't notice my new husband watching until it was too late. When I finally glanced toward the head table, Dorian sat frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, his face carrying an expression I'd never seen before, like he was watching something die in real time. Our first dance as husband and wife happened 20 minutes later. His hands felt different against my waist, careful, distant, like he was handling something that might break or bite. The photographer kept encouraging us to move closer, to smile more naturally, but there was a wall between us that hadn't existed that morning. "Everything okay?" I whispered against his ear as we swayed to our chosen song. "Perfect," he replied, but his voice carried the flatness of someone reading from a script. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of growing silence, of Dorian coming home later and later from his job teaching high school English, of conversations that felt like negotiations between strangers. I kept telling myself it would pass, that he was just adjusting to married life, that his natural introversion was making him withdraw. But then I found the business card. It was tucked into the pocket of his jacket, the same grey blazer he'd worn to our wedding. I wasn't snooping, just checking pockets before taking his clothes to the dry cleaner. The card was simple, expensive-looking. Morrison and Associates Family Law, specializing in divorce and custody matters. My hands shook as I held it. When had he gotten this? How long had he been planning? The date on the back, written in his careful teacher's handwriting, was from 2 weeks after our wedding. 2 weeks after that dance with Felix. "Mom, why are you crying?" I spun around to find Nora, my 9-year-old daughter from my first marriage, standing in the kitchen doorway. Her dark eyes, so much like her biological father's, were wide with concern. She'd been asking more questions lately about why Dorian and I barely talked anymore. Why he spent so much time in his study with the door closed. "I'm not crying, sweetheart," I lied, quickly wiping my eyes. "Just tired from work." But Nora wasn't fooled. She'd inherited my stubborn streak and her father's analytical mind. "Is Dorian going to leave us like Daddy did?" The question hit like a physical blow. Her biological father had walked out when she was 3, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility of parenthood. Dorian had been the stable presence in her life for the past 4 years, the man who helped with homework and attended school plays and never missed a bedtime story. "Of course not," I said, pulling her into a hug that felt more desperate than comforting. "Dorian loves us. He's just stressed about work." But even as I said the words, I could feel their hollowness, because deep down, I knew that everything had changed that night on the dance floor. One careless touch, One moment of letting my guard down, and now my carefully constructed life was crumbling around me. The front door opened, and Dorian's voice called out his usual greeting. "I'm home." But there was no warmth in it anymore, no expectation of response. Just an announcement, like a hotel guest informing the front desk of their arrival. I shoved the business card back into his jacket pocket and tried to compose myself. Whatever was happening between us, I could fix it. I had to fix it. Because the alternative, losing Dorian, watching Nora go through another abandonment, facing the judgment of my family and friends, was unthinkable. But as I heard his footsteps on the stairs, deliberately avoiding the kitchen where he knew I'd be, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. The gym became my sanctuary, the one place where I could breathe freely without feeling Dorian's watchful eyes cataloguing my every movement. Felix's training sessions had evolved into something more intimate over the past month, though I kept telling myself we were just rekindling our friendship. "You seem tense today," Felix observed, adjusting the weight on my bench press. His hands brushed mine as he helped me position the bar, and I felt that familiar flutter of excitement I'd been missing at home. "Things have been complicated," I admitted, focusing on his encouraging smile, rather than the guilt gnawing at my chest. "Marriage is harder than I expected." Felix nodded knowingly. He'd never married, claimed he was too focused on his career and fitness goals to settle down. It was one of the things that had driven us apart in college, but now it felt refreshing. Here was someone who understood that personal growth and self-care had to come first. "You deserve to be happy, Lunelle," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for taking care of yourself." Those words became my mantra over the following weeks. When I started meeting Felix for coffee after our training sessions, I told myself it was self-care. When our conversations grew more personal, more intimate, I rationalized it as finally having someone who understood me. When he started texting me throughout the day, encouraging messages, inside jokes, photos from his own workouts, I convinced myself it was just friendship. The lies came easier than I expected. I told Dorian I was working late when I was actually at Bistro Cafe with Felix, discussing everything from our college memories to our current frustrations. I told my coworker Janet that I was having marriage counseling sessions when I was spending extended lunch breaks at Felix's apartment, letting him cook for me and remind me what it felt like to be appreciated. "You're glowing lately," Janet commented one afternoon as I returned from another counseling session, my hair slightly mussed and my lipstick reapplied. "Marriage must be agreeing with you." I smiled and nodded, not trusting myself to elaborate. Janet was a gossip, and while I enjoyed her attention, I knew better than to give her actual ammunition. Still, her comment validated what I'd been feeling, that my time with Felix was bringing out the best in me, making me feel alive in ways that my marriage never had. At home, the distance between Dorian and me continued to grow. He'd started working late too, claiming he needed extra time to grade papers and prepare lesson plans. When he was home, he spent hours in his study, emerging only for dinner and brief conversations about household logistics. "How was your day?" became our standard exchange, delivered with the enthusiasm of people reading from a script. "Fine. Yours?" "Fine." Nora noticed, of course. She started spending more time in her room, her usually chatty demeanor replaced by careful observation of the tension between her mother and stepfather. When Dorian did engage with her, helping with homework or reading bedtime stories, she clung to him with desperate intensity, as if sensing his emotional withdrawal from the family. "Is Dorian mad at us?" she asked one evening, after he'd excused himself from dinner early, claiming he had papers to grade. "He's not mad, sweetheart," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Adults sometimes need space to work through their feelings. But privately, I was growing frustrated with his behavior. Yes, I'd made a mistake at our wedding. Yes, I'd been spending time with Felix. But I hadn't done anything truly wrong. I was simply rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under the expectations of marriage and motherhood. If Dorian couldn't understand that, if he was going to punish me with silence and withdrawal, then maybe he wasn't the man I thought he was. My mother, Vivienne, reinforced this perspective during our weekly phone calls. "Darling, you can't be expected to shrink yourself to make Dorian comfortable," she said when I finally confided some of my frustrations. "You're a vibrant, intelligent woman who deserves to feel fulfilled. If he's threatened by your personal growth, that's his insecurity to manage." She was right, of course. I'd always been independent, always prioritized my own needs and goals. That's how I'd survived my first marriage falling apart, how I'd built a successful career in insurance claims analysis, how I'd created a stable life for Nora and myself. Dorian had fallen in love with that independence. He couldn't expect me to abandon it just because we'd signed a marriage certificate. The validation from both my mother and Felix gave me the confidence to push boundaries further. I started inviting Felix to group activities, drinks with co-workers, community events, even Sunday dinner at Dorian's mother's house. I introduced him as my trainer and old friend, emphasizing the professional nature of our relationship while enjoying the subtle jealousy I detected in other women's eyes. Gina, Dorian's mother, was less impressed. She was a sharp woman in her 60s, fiercely protective of her son and granddaughter. During that first Sunday dinner with Felix present, she watched our interactions with the calculating gaze of someone gathering intelligence. "Felix seems very attentive," she commented as we cleared dishes, her tone carefully neutral. "He's been wonderful for my fitness journey," I replied, matching her diplomatic tone. "Dorian appreciates how much healthier I've become." But Dorian didn't look appreciative. He looked like a man watching his life unravel in slow motion, too polite to make a scene, but too hurt to pretend everything was normal. His younger brother Tristan tried to engage him in conversation about sports and current events, but Dorian's responses were distracted, his attention frequently drifting to wherever Felix and I happened to be in the room. After dinner, as Felix helped me carry dishes to the kitchen, I felt emboldened by the wine and the attention. When he complimented my dress, I let my hand linger on his arm in thanks. When he mentioned how much he'd missed spending time with me, I smiled in a way that definitely crossed the line from friendship into flirtation. I didn't notice Dorian watching from the doorway until Felix had already left and the evening was winding down. But something in his expression, a combination of resignation and determination, made my stomach clench with unease. That night, I found him in his study again, writing in a leather-bound notebook I'd never seen before. When I asked about it, he closed it quickly and said it was just lesson planning. But I caught a glimpse of what looked like dates and times, written in his careful teacher's handwriting. The thought that he might be documenting something, our arguments, my absences, my interactions with Felix, should have alarmed me. Instead, it made me angry. What right did he have to spy on me, to treat me like a suspect in some investigation? I was his wife, not his student. I deserved trust and respect, not surveillance and suspicion. But as I lay awake that night, listening to Dorian's careful breathing beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The business card, the notebook, the way he looked at me now, like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize. I told myself it didn't matter. I was finally happy, finally feeling like myself again. If Dorian couldn't handle that, if he was going to retreat into his books and his silence, then maybe we needed to have a serious conversation about what we both wanted from this marriage. I had no idea that conversation was coming sooner than I expected, and that it would happen in the most public, humiliating way possible. The confrontation at Bistro Café wasn't supposed to happen. Felix and I had been meeting there for weeks without incident, tucked into our usual corner booth, where we could talk freely about everything, from our shared past to our current frustrations. It had become our safe space, our bubble of understanding in a world that seemed increasingly complicated. That particular Thursday afternoon, Felix was telling me about his plans to expand his personal training business, his eyes bright with ambition and possibility. I found myself leaning across the table, genuinely invested in his dreams, in a way I hadn't felt about anyone's goals in years. "You're incredible," I said, letting my fingers trace along his forearm as he gestured excitedly. "I've always admired your drive." He caught my hand in his, squeezing gently. "Having you believe in me again means everything, Lunelle." I forgot how good we were together. The word sent a thrill through me that I tried to ignore. We weren't together. I was married after all. But there was no denying the connection between us, the way he made me feel seen and valued in ways that Dorian never had. When Felix looked at me, he saw the woman I used to be, the woman I was becoming again. Not just a wife and mother, but someone with her own desires and ambitions. "I should probably get back to work," I said reluctantly, though I made no move to leave. These stolen hours had become the highlight of my days, the thing that made everything else bearable. "5 more minutes," Felix said, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "I love watching you relax. You're always so tense when you talk about home." He wasn't wrong. The house that should have felt like a sanctuary had become a minefield of careful conversations and loaded silences. Dorian and I barely spoke beyond logistics anymore, and when we did, every word felt weighted with unspoken accusations and disappointments. "Marriage is more complicated than I expected," I admitted, voicing thoughts I'd never shared with anyone except Felix. "Sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake." Felix's grip on my hand tightened. "You deserve someone who appreciates everything about you, not someone who makes you feel like you have to hide parts of yourself." The validation was intoxicating. Here was someone who understood that I was more than just a role to be filled, more than just a wife and mother. I was a complete person with needs and desires that mattered. "Lunelle." The voice behind me was quiet, controlled, but it sent ice through my veins. I turned to see Dorian standing beside our table, still wearing his jacket from school, his expression unreadable. How long had he been there? How much had he heard? "Dorian," I said, quickly pulling my hand away from Felix's, "what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question." His voice was steady, but I caught the slight tremor that suggested barely contained emotion. "Hello, Felix." Felix had the grace to look uncomfortable, though he didn't apologize or try to explain. Instead, he stood and extended his hand in greeting, as if this were a normal social encounter instead of a husband discovering his wife in an intimate conversation with another man. "Dorian, good to see you." Dorian ignored the offered handshake. "I'm sure it is." The cafe had gone quiet around us, other patrons sensing the tension and turning to watch the drama unfold. I felt heat creep up my neck as I realized how this must look. My hand in Felix's, our heads bent together in intimate conversation, the guilty expression I could feel spreading across my face. "This isn't what it looks like," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. "What does it look like, Lunelle?" Dorian asked, his teacher's voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent cafe. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife is holding hands with her ex-boyfriend, telling him that marrying me was a mistake." The public nature of the confrontation made everything worse. I could see phones being pulled out, people recording what was clearly about to become a spectacle. My professional reputation, my carefully maintained image, was about to be destroyed in front of half the town. "You're being dramatic," I said, standing to face him. "Felix and I are friends. We were just talking." "Friends," Dorian repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. "Is that what you call the person you've been meeting secretly for weeks? The person you lied about when you said you were working late?" My stomach dropped. He knew. Somehow he'd figured out my schedule, tracked my movements, the notebook, the careful documentation. He'd been building a case against me. "You've been spying on me," I asked, anger replacing embarrassment. What kind of husband does that? The kind whose wife started acting like a stranger the day after their wedding, Dorian replied. The kind who finds hotel receipts in his wife's purse. The kind who notices when his wife's overtime claims don't match her actual work schedule. Hotel receipts. My blood ran cold. Felix and I had only been to a hotel once, last week, when his apartment was being fumigated. It was innocent. We'd just talked, shared lunch, nothing more. But I could see how it would look to someone already suspicious. You went through my purse? I asked, desperate to shift the focus back to his behavior rather than mine. I was looking for Nora's inhaler, he said quietly. Imagine my surprise when I found a receipt for a hotel room on a day when you were supposedly at a work conference. Felix stepped forward, his protective instincts finally kicking in. Look, man, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. Am I? Dorian turned his attention to Felix, and for the first time, I saw real anger in his expression. Then please enlighten me. What exactly is your relationship with my wife? We're friends, Felix said, but his voice lacked conviction. We have history, sure, but we're both adults. We can handle a friendship. A friendship that requires hotel rooms and secret meetings and lies to her husband, Dorian said. That's a very special kind of friendship. The sarcasm in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. Dorian was mild-mannered, reserved, the kind of man who avoided confrontation at all costs. Seeing him like this, publicly challenging me, refusing to back down, was both shocking and somehow thrilling. I don't have to justify my friendships to you, I said, my own anger rising. I'm not your property, Dorian. I'm allowed to have relationships outside our marriage. Relationships, he repeated. Is that what we're calling it now? The cafe was completely silent now. Every conversation stopped to listen to our public dissolution. I could see Janet from work at a corner table, her eyes wide with shock and what looked like excitement. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know about this confrontation. Felix put his hand on my shoulder, a gesture of support that I appreciated even as I realized how it would look to everyone watching. Maybe we should take this somewhere private, he suggested. No, Dorian said firmly. I think we've had enough private conversations. I think it's time for some honesty. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it on the table between us. Divorce papers, he said simply. I filed this morning. The words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever I'd been expecting from this confrontation, it wasn't this. Not public humiliation, not legal documents, not the complete destruction of everything I'd thought I could control. You can't be serious, I whispered. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Dorian replied. I won't be made a fool of anymore, Lunelle. I won't pretend that what you're doing is acceptable or that our marriage can survive this level of dishonesty. Felix stepped closer to me, his arm sliding around my waist in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting, but felt more like a claim of ownership. You don't have to take this, he murmured in my ear. That's when Dorian snapped. I saw it happen, the careful control he'd maintained throughout the confrontation finally cracking. He stepped forward, his face inches from Felix's, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the silent cafe. Take your hands off my wife. Felix, perhaps emboldened by what he saw as Dorian's weakness, didn't back down. Instead, he tightened his grip on my waist and smiled. She's a grown woman, Dorian. She can make her own choices. You're right, Dorian said. She can, and she has. But until those divorce papers are signed, she's still my wife, and I won't watch you paw at her in public. Paw at her? Felix's voice rose, his own temper flaring. You're the one who drove her away, man. You're the one who made her so unhappy that she needed to find someone who actually appreciates her. The words hung in the air like a confession, confirming everything Dorian had suspected about the nature of our relationship. I saw the moment when his last hope for reconciliation died, replaced by something harder and more determined. Thank you, Dorian said quietly, for being honest about what this is. Felix, realizing he'd said too much, tried to backtrack. Look, I didn't mean... But Dorian was already turning away, walking toward the cafe exit with the measured pace of someone who had made an irreversible decision. I started to follow him, some instinct telling me that this was the moment when everything could still be saved, but Felix caught my arm. Let him go, he said. You're better off without him anyway. But as I watched Dorian's retreating figure, as I saw the phone still recording our public spectacle, as I realized that my marriage was ending, not with private tears, but with community-wide humiliation, I wasn't sure I agreed. The divorce papers sat on the table between Felix and me, like a death certificate, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The video went viral within hours. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation at Bistro Cafe, and by evening, it was circulating through every social media platform in town. The audio was crystal clear. My admission about marriage being a mistake, Felix's possessive behavior, Dorian's controlled fury, and the moment when everything fell apart. I watched it on my phone that night, sitting alone in our bedroom while Dorian slept in the guest room. Seeing myself from an outside perspective was horrifying. I looked guilty, defensive, like exactly the kind of woman who would cheat on her devoted husband with her ex-boyfriend. Felix looked predatory, his hands claiming territory that didn't belong to him. And Dorian looked like a man who had tried everything to save his marriage before finally accepting defeat. The comments were brutal. People I barely knew felt entitled to judge my choices, to speculate about my character, to predict my future. Former friends from high school emerged from the woodwork to share their opinions about my behavior. Even strangers weighed in, calling me everything from selfish to pathetic to worse. She threw away a good man for a gym rat, read one comment that had dozens of likes. Hope it was worth it. Another said, that poor little girl. Another broken home because Mum couldn't keep it in her pants. The mention of Nora made my stomach clench with guilt and fear. She was at school when the video started circulating, but kids talked and their parents talked more. How long before she saw it? How would I explain this to her? Work the next day was a nightmare. Janet, who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, was suddenly my closest confidant, eager to dissect every moment of the drama. But her attention felt more voyeuristic than supportive, and I could see other co-workers whispering when they thought I wasn't looking. So what happens now? Janet asked during our lunch break, her eyes bright with curiosity. Are you going to fight the divorce? I don't know, I admitted. This all happened so fast. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. This had been building for months, ever since that wedding dance with Felix, maybe even longer, if I was honest with myself. The signs had been there, Dorian's growing distance, his careful documentation, his late-night conversations with his brother. I'd just chosen to ignore them, because facing the truth would have required admitting that my actions had consequences. The real blow came that afternoon when HR called me into a meeting. Sandra Williams, the department head, sat across from me with a stack of papers and an expression I'd never seen before, professional disappointment mixed with personal concern. Lunelle, we need to discuss some discrepancies in your timesheets, she said without preamble. Your overtime claims for the past 2 months don't match your keycard access records. My heart sank. In my eagerness to create alibis for my meetings with Felix, I'd been claiming extra hours at work when I was actually at the cafe or his apartment. It seemed harmless at the time. Everyone fudged their hours occasionally, and I was a good employee who deserved the benefit of the doubt. I sometimes work from home, I said, trying to sound confident, or take work to do during lunch breaks. Sandra consulted her papers. According to your claims, you worked until 9 p.m. last Tuesday, but your keycard shows you left the building at 3:30. Can you explain that discrepancy? I couldn't, not without admitting where I'd actually been. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of my mounting lies. "Lunelle, you're a valued employee, but this is a serious matter," Sandra continued. "We're going to need to conduct a full review of your recent timesheets. In the meantime, I'm afraid we'll have to suspend your overtime privileges and place a note in your personnel file." The professional consequences were bad enough, but the personal humiliation was worse. Sandra had been a mentor to me, someone who had supported my career advancement and trusted my integrity. Seeing disappointment in her eyes felt like losing a family member's respect. When I got home that evening, I found Nora sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her, but she wasn't working. Instead, she was staring at her tablet with an expression that made my blood run cold. "Nora, what are you looking at?" She turned the screen toward me, and I saw the video, the one that had destroyed my reputation and my marriage in the span of 5 minutes. Someone at school must have shown it to her, or maybe she'd found it herself when kids started whispering. "Is this why Dorian moved to the guest room?" she asked, her 9-year-old voice carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. I sat down beside her, trying to find words that could explain the unexplainable. "Sweetheart, adults sometimes have complicated relationships." "You were holding hands with Felix," she interrupted, her dark eyes accusing. "You lied to me. You said you were working late, but you were with Felix." The simple honesty of her observation cut deeper than any online comment or professional reprimand. I had lied to her, repeatedly and deliberately. I'd put my own desires ahead of her need for stability and truth. "I'm sorry," I said, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "Are you going to leave Dorian like Daddy left us?" The question broke my heart. "No, baby, I'm not leaving anyone." "But Dorian might leave us," she said, with the brutal clarity of childhood. "Because of what you did." Before I could respond, the front door opened and Dorian's voice called out his usual greeting, though it sounded even more hollow than before. Nora immediately jumped up and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist with desperate intensity. "Don't leave us," she whispered against his shirt, and I saw him close his eyes in pain. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," he said, but his eyes found mine over her head, and I could see the lie in them. He was already gone, emotionally, if not physically. That night, after Nora was in bed, Dorian and I had our first real conversation since the cafe confrontation. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the divorce papers between us like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. "I want joint custody," he said without preamble. "Nora doesn't deserve to be punished for our mistakes." Our mistakes. Even now, he was being generous, sharing blame that belonged entirely to me. "She's not your biological daughter," I said, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left my mouth. His expression hardened. "I've been her father for 4 years. I've loved her, supported her, been there for every important moment in her life. Don't you dare try to use biology as a weapon against me." He was right, and we both knew it. Nora adored him, trusted him, needed him. Taking him away from her would be cruel beyond measure. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean that." "Didn't you?" he asked. "Because it seems like you've been looking for ways to hurt me for months now. The lies, the affair, the public humiliation. Was any of it enough? Or do you need to destroy my relationship with Nora too?" "It's not an affair," I protested weakly. "Felix and I we didn't—" "You didn't what, Lunelle? Sleep together? Because I found more than hotel receipts in your purse. I found text messages you forgot to delete. I found evidence of a relationship that goes far beyond friendship. My phone, I'd forgotten about the backup that synced to our shared computer, the one Dorian used for lesson planning. He'd seen everything, the flirtatious messages, the photos Felix had sent, the conversations about our future together. "I want you out of the house by the end of the week," he continued. "You can stay until then for Nora's sake, but after that, we'll arrange supervised visitation until the custody hearing." Supervised visitation? The words hit me like a slap. I'm her mother. "You're also someone who's been lying consistently for months," someone who's shown poor judgment in multiple areas of your life. The court will want to ensure Nora's stability and safety. The clinical way he discussed our family's destruction was almost worse than anger would have been. This was Dorian the teacher, methodical and thorough, presenting facts without emotional embellishment. "What about counseling?" I asked desperately. "What about trying to work this out?" "I tried, Lunelle. I tried for months to reach you, to understand what was happening to us. But you were already gone, already building a life that didn't include me. I won't compete with Felix for my own wife's attention anymore." The finality in his voice told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a negotiation, or a threat meant to bring me back in line. This was the end, delivered with the same careful consideration Dorian brought to everything else in his life. As I lay awake that night in our empty bedroom, listening to the sounds of a house that was no longer my home, I finally understood what I had lost. Not just a husband, but a partner. Not just a marriage, but a family. Not just my reputation, but my daughter's sense of security. And Felix, the man I'd risked everything for, hadn't called or texted since the cafe confrontation. When the consequences became real, when my choices demanded actual sacrifice, he'd disappeared as quickly as he'd reappeared in my life. I was alone with the wreckage of my choices, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I had no one to blame but myself. Felix's apartment was empty when I finally worked up the courage to go there. The landlord, a gruff man in his 60s, stood in the doorway of the vacant unit and shrugged when I asked about my former trainer's whereabouts. "Broke his lease 3 days ago," he said. "Paid the penalty and cleared out overnight. Left no forwarding address." I stared at the empty space where Felix's life had been, the living room where we'd shared intimate conversations, the kitchen where he'd cooked for me, the bedroom I'd never entered but had thought about more than I cared to admit. All of it was gone, as if our relationship had been nothing more than a mirage. "Did he say why he was leaving?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Nope, just said he had a job opportunity in another state. Seemed in a hurry to get out of town." Of course he was. When the video went viral, when our affair became public knowledge, when the consequences became real instead of theoretical, Felix had done what Felix always did. He'd prioritized himself and disappeared. I thought about all his talk of expanding his business, of building something meaningful together, of appreciating everything about me. Apparently, that appreciation had limits. The drive home was a blur of anger and humiliation. I'd destroyed my marriage for a man who couldn't even be bothered to say goodbye, let alone stand by me when things got difficult. The fairy tale I'd constructed in my head, the story of rediscovered love and personal fulfillment, crumbled completely in the face of Felix's abandonment. At home, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Dorian had moved most of his belongings to his mother's house, returning only to spend time with Nora and collect more of his things. They would sit together at the kitchen table, working on her homework or reading, and I could see how desperately she was trying to memorize every moment with him. "Will you still help me with my book report after you move out?" she asked him one evening, her voice small and scared. "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, but I caught the glance he shot in my direction. A reminder that his continued involvement in her life depended on legal arrangements that hadn't been finalized yet. My mother Vivienne tried to be supportive, but even her loyalty was wavering under the weight of public opinion and mounting evidence of my poor choices. "Darling, I think you need to consider that maybe this marriage wasn't meant to be," she said during one of our phone calls. "But perhaps you could have handled the transition more. Gracefully. Gracefully, as if there was an elegant way to destroy a family, a dignified method for breaking a child's heart. Felix left town," I told her, needing to share the humiliation with someone. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "I see," she finally said. "Well, perhaps that's for the best. You need to focus on rebuilding your life now, not on relationships that were clearly temporary. Even my own mother was distancing herself from the choices she'd encouraged me to make. The woman who had insisted on inviting Felix to my wedding, who had supported my personal growth and self-care, was now suggesting that maybe I should have been more careful. The legal proceedings moved forward with terrifying efficiency. Dorian's attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morrison, had assembled a case that painted me as an unfit mother and unfaithful wife. Every lie I'd told, every hour I'd falsified at work, every secret meeting with Felix was documented with the thoroughness of a criminal investigation. "Your husband has been very methodical," my own lawyer, an overworked public defender named Tom Richards, explained during our first meeting. "He has bank records showing unusual spending patterns, hotel receipts, text message logs, witness statements from co-workers and family members. This isn't going to be easy to defend against." "But I never actually slept with Felix," I protested. "We never had sex. Doesn't that matter?" Tom looked at me with the weary expression of someone who'd heard every excuse and rationalization in the book. "Emotional affairs can be just as damaging as physical ones, Mrs. Harker. And the evidence suggests your relationship with Mr. Trenton was heading in a physical direction, regardless of whether it reached that point. He was right, and we both knew it. Felix and I had been dancing around the physical aspect of our relationship for weeks, building toward an intimacy that felt inevitable. The hotel room, the secret meetings, the increasingly romantic text messages. It was all foreplay to an affair that would have been consummated if Dorian hadn't intervened. The custody evaluation was scheduled for the following week, and I knew it wouldn't go well. Nora had been withdrawn and anxious since the cafe confrontation, clinging to Dorian when he was around and barely speaking to me when we were alone. The court-appointed psychologist would see that immediately, would recognize that my choices had destabilized the one thing that should have been my priority, my daughter's emotional well-being. Work became another source of stress. The investigation into my timesheet discrepancies had expanded, and HR was now questioning other aspects of my employment. Co-workers who had once been friendly were now distant, professional. Janet, my former confidant, had apparently shared details of our conversations with anyone who would listen, turning my private struggles into office gossip. I heard she was meeting her ex at hotels during work hours. I overheard someone saying in the break room, "Can you imagine using company time to cheat on your husband?" The worst part was that I couldn't defend myself without admitting to even more lies and poor choices. Every attempt to explain my behavior only made things worse, revealed new layers of deception and selfishness. Dorian's family had closed ranks completely. His mother Gina, who had always been politely distant, was now openly hostile. When I tried to call and explain my side of the story, she cut me off before I could say more than a few words. "You've done enough damage, Lunelle," she said, her voice cold with fury. "That little girl doesn't deserve what you've put her through, and neither does my son. I hope the court sees you for exactly what you are." Even Tristan, Dorian's younger brother, who had always been kind to me, refused to take my calls. The family that had welcomed me, that had included me in their traditions and celebrations, had expelled me completely. The night before the custody hearing, I sat in my empty house. Dorian had taken Nora to stay with his mother, and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. 6 months ago, I'd been a respected professional with a loving family and a stable marriage. Now I was facing the loss of my daughter, my home, my reputation, and my livelihood. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, desperate, aged beyond her years by stress and regret. This wasn't the confident, independent person I'd thought I was becoming through my relationship with Felix. This was someone who had gambled everything on a fantasy and lost. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and for a moment, my heart leaped with the hope that it might be Felix, finally reaching out to explain his disappearance. Instead, it was a message from someone who had seen the viral video. Hope destroying your family was worth it, you selfish bitch. I deleted it without responding, but the words echoed in my mind as I tried to fall asleep in the bedroom I'd once shared with a man who had loved me completely. Tomorrow I would face a judge who would decide whether I deserved to be part of my daughter's daily life. Tomorrow, I would learn the final cost of choices that had seemed so reasonable, so justified, so necessary at the time. And Felix, the man I'd risked everything for, was somewhere far away, probably already charming his way into someone else's life, leaving me to face the consequences of our relationship alone. The net Dorian had been carefully weaving around me was about to close completely, and I finally understood that I had helped him tie every knot. The courthouse smelled of floor wax and fear. My lawyer, Tom Richards, met me outside family court with grim eyes. Be honest, show remorse, don't justify, the evidence is overwhelming. Inside, Dorian sat calm beside his attorney, flanked by his mother and brother. My side held only my mother Vivienne, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Judge Chen called order. Dorian's lawyer presented months of deception, bank records, hotel receipts, falsified work logs, intimate texts with Felix. The cafe video played, my voice admitting regret about marrying Dorian, Felix claiming I deserved better. The sound of my own betrayal filled the silent room. School counselors testified to Nora's anxiety, withdrawal, questions about abandonment. The psychologist described her fear that I'd leave like Daddy did. Dorian spoke quietly of trying to save the marriage, finding a divorce attorney's card 2 weeks after our wedding, hoping we could fix it, until the lies became impossible to ignore. My testimony faltered. Every defense sounded hollow. My mother's support crumbled under cross-examination. Judge Chen ruled swiftly. Primary custody to Dorian, supervised visitation for me, 2 hours weekly, pending counseling and change. The gavel fell like a door slamming shut. Dorian approached as I stood. I wanted us to be a family, he said softly. You destroyed it. I just documented the truth. I walked out alone, past reporters, into a future reduced to supervised hours with my 9-year-old daughter. The quiet man I'd dismissed had used nothing but facts to serve justice I could no longer deny.